The wheel of time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. Each week, we will be reading, discussing, and digesting a small selection from Robert Jordan's fantasy opus. This quest is led by Tylor, a true Wheel of Time warrior.
I have all stories, ages that were and that will be. And I'll be joined by Greg, a complete novice to the Wheel of Time.
The Wheel of Time and the wheel of a man's life turn alike without pity or mercy.
Join us each week as we read the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time, traveling deeper and deeper through the glass columns.
But what does that even mean?
No. You don't get to find out yet.
All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your adventure through the Wheel of Time with two people taking their sweet time to do it. So my name, of course, is Greg, and I am new to the Wheel of Time series. And joining me, as always, my faithful companion, should the Trollocs come, Tylor, the Wheel of Time expert. Tylor, how are you doing tonight?
I am doing fairly well. I need you to be aware that if the Trollocs come, I will not be there for you. I am going to run in the opposite direction very quickly, but otherwise, you're exactly right. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled we're getting a chance to finally kind of get into the meat of the book a little bit, right? We've been talking for a few weeks now about things, starting to get a little slow, starting to get kind of character oriented. And finally, this week, we have two chapters. So those are chapters 5, 4, and 5, Winternight and the Westwood. And we're going to start today by discussing the first of those chapters, Winternight. So the chapter begins, as every good book chapter does, by describing the kind of chores that you need to do on a farm. Once we finish that, however, Tam and Rand turn in for the night. There's a knock at the door, which is very surprising in the Westwood. It turns out it is not the neighbors. It is a group of Trollocs. Tam turns out to know how to use the sword that he has been storing underneath the bed for quite some time. He kills a few Trollocs. He manages to get them away while Rand hides in the woods. Eventually, he rejoins up with Rand, but is injured. And so Rand has to go back to the house. He has a confrontation with Narg, the single most talkative Trolloc possibly in the entire series. He manages to more or less accidentally kill it, and then makes his way back to Tam, hopefully to escape and make their way towards Emond's Field, although we'll see that is not an especially smooth trip once we get to the next chapter. But as far as Winternight, we finally have some things happening, Greg. So what was your first impression upon reading it?
Well, so I just told Tylor before we started recording, I came to this session fresh from a family barbecue, and I have a great brother-in-law. He and I get along really well, but we don't have a terribly high amount in common to neither of our faults. But we, when we find something, we talk about it. And I knew that this was Wheel of Time is one of his favorite book series. So I mentioned that we had started this project, and he said to me, like, well, it's really hard to start, but once, you get to the conflict, you'll just be done the rest of the book like that. And, I don't think that sums up how I felt about those opening chapters, but this did feel suddenly propulsive, and it felt like a different book, just because the action has started up and we're moving. I did not agree with my brother-in-law says, once you hit that, then the rest of the book just disappears and you're just done. And I'm like, well, that's kind of not my deal with this podcast. So we're still going to take our time, but I appreciate the emotion he was sharing with that. So I like it. I'm all for it. I think I'm somebody who appreciates character because character makes action meaningful. And so I did care here when Rand and Tam are in trouble because I've already kind of grown attached to them and interested in what happens to them. How are you feeling either this read through or kind of in general as we step into the wider world?
This to me is one of the turning points in this book. I'll be honest, when I tell people like, hey, it starts a little slow, but you'll definitely get there. My concern is less about whether it's like plot or character and just about the sheer number of pages that there are before we get to some of the stuff, right? Because I know a lot of my friends who I recommend to read this book, they're used to novels that are 250 pages long. And I'm like, well, you're going to have to do half of that before something happens. And I'm fine with that. I think it's great. I love me a long fantasy novel, but it's a little bit, it takes a little time. And even from here, I think, me personally, we're still a little ways from when I say, okay, now we are like off. You will read the next 14 books without thinking about it. So
Yeah.
I think it's the same kind of process of just learning to know the characters and being okay with the fact that 100 pages in this book series is 1/100th of the series instead of, a tenth like we're used to in a lot of the things we read.
Yeah, and it is something that I've grown accustomed to reading fantasy. Like fantasy is the collection of giant doorstop books, and it can be daunting. But I had the experience on a recent plane ride where it was like I was just shut in. My phone wasn't working because we were not on Wi-Fi, and so I just took my brick of a fantasy book, and once I was absorbed, it was like I think I read 350 pages on my flight. I'm like, I never just sit and read 350 pages. And it's like the best feeling. And I think a good fantasy book does that. You get so soaked into the world that, you do kind of blink and suddenly that much is gone. But I agree with you. It's only if you do the homework, do the kind of building, getting into the whole world. The other series I'm reading is Ken Liu's Dandelion Dynasty, which is a phenomenal set of books, which I don't think has a wide following, but I'm very much enjoying. And it will be like 200 pages of kind of like, let's just set up everything, and then just like a climax that is just 400 pages of just nonstop surprises. But that's a different podcast that I'll start later. So I really liked your description here at the beginning of Winternight of the kind of the chores, right? And all the chores you have to do when you work on a farm. I grew up on a farm, a recreational farm, not a like working farm. So, in terms of like mucking out stalls and planting stuff, I'm like, yeah, I know this life. This is familiar. And it was a reminder too of how small their existence had been, really, I guess, until this night, that it was all about the crops and the kind of backbreaking work that farming entails, that you do a day full of chores and then you go to bed and you start the next day full of chores. And so it was a nice reminder, but I think it felt like it was about to be broken and then delivered on that promise.
Yeah, and I actually, the chores scene actually has one of my favorite bits of writing that we have read so far. When Jordan's writing about Rand chopping wood and losing himself in it, and he kind of gives us another hint of the like metaphor of the flame in the void, kind of along with him losing himself in that work. I'm like, this is just beautiful, even though it's like a page and a half about Rand chopping wood. It's not the ideal subject, but I thought it was fantastic. The other thing that jumps out at me in terms of just description and to push us just a little further into the chapter is we get this just rich, beautiful description of Tam's sword that's almost a solid page of the book. And that sword almost feels like a character the first time that it appears. So I'm curious if you picked up anything in there, if you were kind of I obviously know what's going to happen with this sword. Sure. So I read about it and I say, okay, this is setting up whatever. But for you, I'm curious whether that stood out or whether it was just like, oh, he has a sword, whatever.
I think what stood out the most was the surprise of the sword, right? Because again, it was a surprise to Rand that he had a sword, and then eventually that he knows how to use it as well. But that the fact that he had it, and it folded into this kind of theme I saw going on from similarly transitioning from the chores into the sword, that how much they read things through the natural world. So when they are first arriving back at the farm and they're saying like, well, could somebody have been here? They look to the sheep and the sheep are unbothered. So it's like, oh no, nothing is an immediate danger because the sheep are calm. And then the cows and the crops are not yielding as much as they should, right? So that's the sense of a larger problem. And so then we get to the sword, which is, man-made and artificial in so many ways, but has cranes on it, I believe.
Herons is the way.
Herons. And so to me, that was like, oh, okay. So we trust in what is natural, kind of assuming this continues to be part of a dichotomy as the book is predicated on. And so to see that like, oh, this is a symbol of the artificial, but imbued with the natural. It was like, well, then it's going to be a powerful object, and it's going to be right and good that we have this. It kind of was what stood out immediately for it. But never mind the fact that it's just an object that shouldn't be in a simple farmhouse, right? It feels like, one of my favorite lines in Raiders of the Lost Ark, Belloc says, "You and I, we're passing through time, but this is history, right? This is," and it felt like the sword was that. I mean, he's referring to the Ark of the Covenant, but it's like, right. No, this is the real deal. We are, simply it's passing through our hands. This is history.
And that's what I really like about these early chapters with Rand and Tam, is you kind of get this really interesting contrast of these two people clearly stand out in Emond's field. Rand because of like a lot of his physical characteristics being different from those around him, and Tam because he has been outside of the two rivers, right? Just the fact that he was somewhere where he could buy a sword for 2 coppers is remarkable in this region. And so I think the fact that we get all of this buildup of these two characters being so different, and then kind of like you said, all of a sudden it just snaps and all of the secrets are out there very, very quickly, I think is kind of an interesting trick for Jordan to pull, especially given, as we're saying, we're still 1/6 of the way into 1/15 of the series. So for some of these secrets to already be coming out, I think it tells you how wide-reaching what Jordan wants to do is, that he's confident enough to say, like, chapter 4, here's the answer to something I've been hinting at.
Yeah. Well, and again, in our D&D group, we'd call this metagaming, but thinking about it in that way, it's also like, well, that just opens up, what is this going to be? Is this going to be generations? Is this going to move around in this timeline, right? Are we, across these 15 books, are we going to see this time period and then go back to when the sword was forged or something like that? And again, a rich fantasy epic gives you time for something like that, as opposed to, a television series or a 2-hour movie of some kind. So let me talk about these Trollocs. So here are the details that stood out to me about them. They have black mail on, so armored, not purely supernatural or beastie. They have horns, and they are immediately recognized as not the Man in Black, right? Like, yes. Rand knows right away. But they are servants of the Dark One. They are known to, that sounded like orcs to me, right? Like, right. In Lord of the Rings, if they're ugly buggers, then they're not good guys. But then later, it seems like I believe the word he uses is a melange of animal features. So some have feathers, some have horns, some have human traits. So it seems to me that picturing like a goblin is not correct, even though Trolloc kind of brings that kind of shape to it. But especially in the context of, the natural gives us these good signs, then this is like a twisted dark nature, right? This is unnatural, and that's problematic. So how's my reading of those? Does that fit?
That's exactly spot on. And to me, the thing that I love about the Trollocs and just kind of the design and the world building of these creatures is that no two of them are exactly the same, right? We get this initial description is like a tall black figure in dark mail with fur and antlers that are like a ram's horns and a wolf muzzle. And then later on, we hear about very different horns. We hear about some that have feathers. We hear about some of them have feet like humans, whereas some of them have hooves. There's all sorts of different details we get about them. And that's kind of what I love about Trollocs, is that they're not just like orcs or Uruk-hai or whatever, fantasy creature we want. That's all kind of very generic and feel the same. All the Trollocs feel pretty different. They look different. They sound different. And even the fact that we get like Narg is the only Trolloc who's smart enough to stick around the farm tells us that there's just significantly more variance in these creatures than I feel like is kind of typical in the like, here's a villain race in a fantasy story, right? Typically, they're just like very generic. They're mean. They're nasty. That is the definition of them. I just think it's really cool that we have something where none of them are exactly the same, and you never quite know what you're going to get when you fight the next Trolloc.
And that, to me, makes them sound more chaotic, right? Yeah. Like as a race, that, it's not that Lord of the Rings orcs or goblins are that, plain or mundane. But to say not only is this a race that has these dark tendencies, but on top of that, I'm gonna keep shifting on what they look like, what they could be. Now, it doesn't sound like any of them could quote unquote pass for human. Like they're always going to stand out in the kind of classic D&D race way, right?
Yeah.
But to actually say like, oh, but you don't know at a given Trolloc what they will look like, that does seem unique to me, at least in my limited fantasy experience.
Yeah, and I mean, I think Trollocs are just they're just a fascinating initial villain, right? Because in a lot of stories like this, I feel like, when I think of like the Shire at the beginning of Lord of the Rings, or when I think of like the first book in Game of Thrones, or when I think a lot of these kind of traditional fantasy series, they tend to be very kind of low magic, low additional races in the very beginning of the story, right? The Shire is just hobbits and maybe some dwarfs if we decide to read The Hobbit first, right? When we think about like the early story of, Game of Thrones, like the dragons don't arrive until the end of the first book or the end of the first season. There's not a whole lot of mysticism there. And so for me, Robert Jordan saying right away, no, the early villain is not a man in black. It's horrible bestial creatures that will stab you in the face. I like we're getting something just a little different from kind of the standard slowly throw you in. Like this feels a little bit of a deep end moment to me, and I like it.
Yeah, I like that point a lot too. And I was thinking of video games, right? So, like in a good fantasy video game, this is the part where you're fetching things around your village, and there's like a village bully who's still human, who's mad at you, and you teach him a lesson and learn how to hit the punch buttons before you go off and find the magical creatures. So you're right. This feels like, it's clearly not a boss, but it is, a step along that path towards something higher, on its way there. And that is exciting. That's certainly fun to see that we're getting there a little faster.
And just
go.
I was just going to say, just as we're thinking about like, we're diving into the deep end a little bit, then to go just a touch further into the chapter, the fact that Tam is able to kill 3 Trollocs while surrounded on both sides is ridiculous. Like Tam knows how to use this sword just based on the physical details of what we've got, right? This is 1 5-something man against a couple of 7-foot tall hulking monster creatures. The fact that 3 of them are dead and he has a small gash is amazing.
So he's the OP'd character they let you play for the tutorial, and then we get sucked back into Rand for the rest of the opening of this. I mean, okay. So thinking about, not only does he have the sword that suggests he's there, but he has considerable skill and that he's able to do that. And certainly Rand's play is, run, which makes sense given where he's at. But what also just stood out to me about these Trollocs is the destruction is huge and vast, right? Like it's physical strength primarily, but doors are shattered. When Rand eventually is able to return to the house, nothing's left. It's not like they knocked over the table. Everything is described as splintered or shattered. So it's not easy to just pick it up. What I like too about this is a little bit of, my Joseph Campbell hat comes on when we have already been through a few of these stages, right? There's the kind of call to adventure is the presence of the man in black that tells you something unorthodox is going on. And, the return to the farm and kind of the hope that the normal festival will continue seems like a type of refusal. And this very much is the underworld, the unknown being like, nope, the adventure's happening, and making it so there is no home, and Rand has to now go out on his adventure. Then help me a little bit with the fade. So I want pronunciation, and then a little bit about how we should be thinking about this character, beast, guy.
At this point, legend that we have maybe seen, I think, is the best we can do. As far as I am aware, they actually on the television show in season 1 never said the word Murdrail, which I think is how that is pronounced. But I can't confirm that. That's what it says in the glossary. By the way, I don't know whether you've noticed at the back of the book, there's a glossary. Some people don't check that if they don't see it in the table of contents. But yes, so Murdrail, what we know about them at this point is They are in charge of Trollocs somehow. Narg says that Murdrail want talk to Rand, and that Rand thinks of Murdrail or Fades as kind of like mythical creatures. He describes them, I think, if it was in this chapter or a previous chapter, he describes Fades as being like 13 feet tall, and they can go into shadows, and there's like a bunch of different things he throws out. And I don't think that
eyes of fire. I had 20 feet tall, I think, in this chapter. Okay. Yeah. So certainly mythic and not well known.
Yeah.
And again, that's sounding more like a mini boss, right? Like, so the person in charge of the Trollocs, but certainly not the Dark One, kind of on our way up that hierarchy. So Murdrail, we should understand as a person, as a Fade, like he's a singular Fade, or he or she, they.
There are Fades.
Okay.
And he is worried about a Fade. Yes.
Okay. So Murdrail sent these particular Trollocs to locate and take over, or grab Rand to go bring him to talk to him. And that was their mission, which has now been disrupted and prevented.
Yeah.
Then I guess the last surprise for me in this chapter was, okay, now we need to go to the Wisdom. We need to go to Nynaeve is
how they are saying it on the television show. Yeah.
And so what surprised me there, again, I'd seen that conflict between the Wisdom and the village council, and it didn't really hint to me, at least at that point, or maybe I just missed it, that they had healing powers, or she has healing powers. But that's okay. Tam is wounded. It's clearly a magical wound. It's causing a fever. It's poison, if not magical. And we need to get him there for healing quickly. And I think that was just a dynamic I wasn't expecting. Seems very interesting considering how much conflict there was between those kind of political groups in the village before. So that's the goal. Go get to her, heal. Very Arwen carrying Frodo again to latch on to what I have seen and read.
Yeah, and I think the only hint that we've actually gotten at Nynaeve having any ability with healing was way, way back in the first prologue Ravens, where Nynaeve was still the Wisdom's apprentice. And so we had that very brief scene where Nynaeve is like treating someone's wound, and the Wisdom like pulls back the bandage and seems disappointed and then puts it back on. So at least from what we've seen so far as we're aware, Nynaeve doesn't have any healing powers. She's the healer of the town. I think she would be thought of kind of like almost the same way, like if you go to the doctor, you go to the Wisdom, is kind of the way they would think of it. So I read it at least as not necessarily being, I think of it as completely bypassing the political tension, right? There may have in the past been tension between the village council and the Wisdom or the women's circle, but like, he's hurt, you go to the Wisdom. That's just what you do in Emmons Field to some degree.
Okay. Yeah, all of that becomes irrelevant when there's an actual crisis going on.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, sounds like my city. Like, oh, we don't actually care which side of the new library issue you were on once the pandemic started. Cool. Do you have anything else for that chapter, or should we just run into the woods?
I think the only other thing that I wanted to mention, even just quite quickly, is I have to say the one big difference for me on this read versus previous reads that I've had of the Wheel of Time is as I really take my time and I'm like breaking down, what's being said and why it's being said, I'm more impressed by Rand in these chapters than I have been in previous reads. Every time I have kind of read through these books, I've always kind of thought of Rand as kind of like, he's the generic one. He's the guy whose head we're in at the beginning of the story. He was always, to me, kind of the like Two Rivers folks who end up being major characters. I always read him as kind of the boring one, but as I read through this more and more, I see him paying attention to politics. And in this chapter, I see him being very thoughtful and careful and, really taking a lot of calculated risks and thinking through what are the harms and downsides of all the different actions. And I just hadn't really thought of Rand as that kind of like thinker in previous reads. And I'm seeing it a little more this time just because I think I'm taking my time more.
Well, and a little interesting that so much of what you described, and now I'm going to insult my people where I'm from, that doesn't describe stereotypical farmers, right? So that, again, a hint that he is different than the small folk that where he comes from, and has a capacity that they don't necessarily. And again, because these themes keep coming up of deep time, that makes me say, okay, who was he before? Where was he, and where will he be again? Yeah, I'm getting this. That's how I was supposed to say that.
There it is.
Awesome. Yeah. So sum up for me, off to the races is what my last note was. It's like, here we go. Like the adventures come and we'll see where this ends up. So shall we go into the Westwood?
Absolutely. So our second chapter of this week, the Westwood, is unfortunately another one of those chapters where summarizing could potentially be Rand carries his father down a road. Mostly this is a chapter primarily about Rand struggling to get Tam to Emond's Field. We see a large amount of him kind of figuring out how is he going to move this travois? How is he going to navigate the woods versus the road, hiding versus being exposed? And we have one moment, kind of the big moment of action in the scene, is where a number of Trollocs as well as the rider in black come down the road in one direction, and then briefly the rider in black comes back and Rand has to hide and make sure that Tam is staying quiet, all of those sorts of things. But I think the meat of this chapter is really very much in Tam's fever dream, right? We hear him talking quite a bit about some sort of conflict. It's not entirely clear what he's describing, but we get lots of detail about something. In the previous chapter, he said he was experiencing dreams of his past. So we know this is probably primarily recollections. And then the big, moment at the end of the chapter is we find out that Tam actually found Rand somewhere on a battlefield and brought him home and adopted him. He and Carrie Althor are not Rand's parents. And this is kind of the big moment for Rand to realize he is not just one of the Emond's Fielders. He's different more than just physically.
Yeah. And, I've confessed to you before that I struggle with dreams in reading fiction. I don't know why. This is something like whatever I'm reading, like a dream sequence starts and I just kind of zone out. And so this was a time when the first couple, I kind of did that zone out thing. It's like, yeah, he's got delusions, like whatever. And then when I realized the third one was so important, I went back and like, no, let's pay attention to these because these are not just kind of mumblings of a fever dream. These are, the third one is a strong, important revelation for a part of that. So racing through the woods, it seems, I noted for the dreams, lots of history that we were getting. So again, these hints that Tam has lived a life prior to this, and how did he end up here in Emond's Field or between the two rivers and so on, is there. And then talked a lot to his wife, which is kind of sweet and endearing, but as that continued, that it kind of demonstrated that the two of them had built the lie together, and that was now coming apart. So totally makes sense. Confirms that Rand's size and his eye color, which was mentioned previously, are not just random chance biology, but something more. The seeming comparison to me was Loki, right? That the first Thor movie hinges on this revelation that Loki is actually a frost giant, and now that was a child meant to guarantee an alliance or a peace in some ways. But it seems like that's less likely here, as much as just a found child that needed protecting in a soft-hearted man. And I really, again, it starts, it's like that, you're a wizard, Harry, or you are the chosen one moment. And I like that Rand is again in denial. He's like, it's just a dream. It's just a dream. Like keep it. Let's go. Let's keep this moving on. So, those are my takeaways from it.
Yeah. I think one thing that I just leaped out at when I was reading this from the very early section of the chapter is there's a section where Rand talks about where he's like basically testing Tam's sword and getting a feel for like how it feels on him and whether he feels like he'd be able to defend himself. And there's one moment where he thinks about, how many times had I imagined, playing with a sword, or how many times had I imagined going on adventures. And then I think it's a really, you're exactly right. The fact that he starts the chapter there and then ends the chapter denying that he is actually someone even remotely different who he thought who could ever have been from outside, I think is a really interesting dynamic of him realizing what he wanted when he was young is not really what he wants now.
And I mean, who knows exactly what age audience Robert Jordan was aiming towards, but that feels like a grown-up thought, right? Like, you know, I'm not one to denigrate people who read only young adult fiction and so on. Like, there's a lot of good works being created there, but it is always, you know, we're so attached to the coming of age moment. And, you know, I think we both have friends, maybe the same friends, who like see themselves as in that coming of age moment when they're like now in their 40s, and you're like, dude, like that's over. Like it's time to build that next step. And I think that, to me, that is, it's exciting to think about. This is a hero who is kind of not just like coming. I mean, he's literally at the coming of age, but there's a little bit more substance there. It's like, oh, like, no, I those are childish dreams. And like, what does it mean to actually be an adult? So I guess what I'm saying is couple what you just said with what you said about the last chapter. And that to me marks him as a different type of hero. He's more of the cold, cool, calculating, a bit more worldly than we perhaps initially understood. So even if this is a coming of age story, you know, it's one for grownups, I guess, is all I'm saying at the end of the day.
I'm pretty sure all of the dead sheep would have told us this is a story for grownups.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. I think I have always, when I read this story, kind of, I read this first when I was very young, right? I was reading these books when I was, 10, 11, 12. And so I was imagining the characters very much as like 14 or 15 years old. But now that I read it, I can recognize, they're significantly older than that, right? They're of marriageable age, probably like 18, 19 years seems about right for these characters. But I think also just from a maturity level, they are not at the place where you typically expect, like you're saying, that generic young adult fantasy story to start. They're a little past not knowing what to do. Perrin's apprenticed and Rand more or less runs the farm along with Tam. They're older than I think the typical fantasy protagonist, and I like that.
Yeah, and so this would predate kind of Harry Potter, and not that YA came from Harry Potter, but so much of modern YA is modeled off of Harry Potter. So yeah, to be dealing with even slightly older, and as you were describing, it's like, 18, 19 marriage age. I was thinking about how, obviously in our modern culture, that's like 30 now. And so it might be that I kind of naturally skew them a little older because, that's when people tend to think about marriage these days. Although again, I was with my rural farmer family, and it was like, oh, this girl graduated high school this year. She'll have her first kid in a year. And I'm like, that is not my life. So to kind of grab a couple things, it seemed very interesting to me that the Trollocs were just immediately allied with the Dark Rider. Made me wonder, could he be a Fade? Could this be Myrddraal? Myrddraal. And there was a moment where when the rider came back, he really seemed to see Rand, right? Like Rand was hidden, but he's like, he felt like he looked right at him and saw him. And so, again, this is a very mysterious figure. He's, coded as evil in all the ways we can be, including leading the monster army. But it made me curious, like, might this be somebody who sees larger strategy afoot and wants Rand to not be captured immediately yet, if he really sensed him or looked at him. And again, it immediately made me think of the hobbits hiding from the Nazgul. Gosh, that took me a long time to think of that word. In a moment that is kind of in the book, but became iconic with that first film of them ducked behind and it looking over them. Only other couple small things in my notes. I liked, again, thinking through these dualities that keep being present. This one was very much about hot and cold, right? The wound went hot and cold, and Tam went hot and cold, and a lot of the imagery kind of oscillated between the two, which, is a good way to represent a fever, right? That's, I
Yeah.
mean, that's what a fever is. And it causes its disorientation. But it also seemed like, it works for their temperaments and their action. They just were very hot and now they're running cold and back and forth. So that was good. I just thought that reinforced some of these themes well. And then that's kind of it. Go.
I was actually just going to say, I think that hot and cold thing is really interesting, given that the detail that we learn is that Tam discovered Rand on a snow-covered mountain because he was escaping the heat of a battle, right?
Nice.
It's very much hot and cold buried throughout even that origin story. I think that's really neat.
And it's Loki, the ice troll. Anyway. But it was striking to me how short this chapter was, because I think of all we've read, this was only, I think it was 7 pages in my edition. And it was like, it had its point, which was clearly we're moving the people and you need this revelation that Rand is learning for himself. Again, thinking of Campbell, he's denying it. He'll obviously have to face the truth of that very soon, and decide what to do with it when he does realize. But, again, a major Campbell theme is that at the end of your journey, you become the master of both worlds. And that's a theme we've seen here with the light and the dark. And so, okay, he's going to have to eventually become master of who he was born into and the family he was taken into. That's good. That's good storytelling. That's good myth. I'm here for that. I want to see what happens. I am going to go on record and say that the wisdom is not going to have any of this. I think she's pissed off still, but we'll see. We'll see if I'm wrong and maybe the wisdom is stronger. Any other thoughts on this chapter for you?
Just 2 things. One, I think you need to be very careful about using the phrase very soon in a 15-book series. That's just be careful. The other thing is I just because I love this world so much, I want to make sure we at least spend a little bit of time talking about the world building. And I actually jotted down like a decent chunk of Tam's speech that I just thought was beautiful. And if I ever have a fever dream, I want it to sound like this, right? He says, they came over the dragon wall like a flood and washed the land with blood. How many died for Laman's sins? They called them savages, the fools, said they would be swept aside like rubbish. How many battles lost? How many cities burned before they faced the truth, before nations stood together against them? It's just beautiful, setting aside how much new information we're getting about some unknown event in the world.
Yeah, I think first of all, just agree, like beautiful, the image of the flood coming over the wall, and just that language, going back to our last episode where you were pointing out how many things were kind of Tuckerizations of our real world events. To me, there's a lot of comps to that phrasing, right? And particularly savages, and was barbarians in there? It was just savages.
I think it was just savages, yeah.
But it may, I went to the Roman Empire, right? And the Vandals and the, I mean, fill in any of 100 different world history events. But it sounds to me like that could be there, right? That again, and by calling them savages and so on, you diminish them and don't take them seriously. But clearly there's a power there.
Yeah. No, and I think just there's 2 or 3 paragraphs from Tam here that, like, just if you're reading these books, go back and read them. They're really good. And in about a book and a half, there'll be some really good information.
All right. Making notes about the flood and the dark and the hot and the cold. And okay. So we'll be back here in season 3 coming in 2026 or whenever we get to it. I mean, again, some excitement here, some energy. We are still recording in advance, and I know we have a friend who started the audiobook and just simply couldn't stop in preparation for this podcast. And I'm starting to get there, especially that if you got this far in the book, it's time to get moving. So homework for next time. This is what we write on the blackboard. So we have chapters 7 and 8. That would be Out of the Woods and A Place of Safety. And we will tackle that next time. Until then, Tyler, a pleasure as always. And hopefully this continues to be enjoyable and you're not about to run yourself over a dragon wall for some savages. Yeah.
You have no problem with me sticking around on this podcast. Once a week, I do like a Greg check. I'm like, are you still okay with this? This is a lot to do. So yeah. I'm glad that you're still along with me. And this is definitely the point in the book where I think we really start to gain some steam and get moving. So I hope everybody comes back and joins us. Please, like we mentioned last week, we're going to be starting having an opportunity to interact with you as we, go live and social media starts going out there. So please shoot us some messages. Drop us an email, anything that you think we could be doing better or that we could be changing. That would be fantastic. Otherwise, we've got 2 chapters next week and things are going to keep happening. The plot actually continues. It's not just character for another 2 chapters. So we'll be tackling those next week through the glass columns.
So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, or Amazon. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, you can email us at throughtheglasscolumns@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Twitter by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to the show, leave us a review wherever you're listening, and recommend the show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time through the Glass Columns.